Hello friends, fellow readers and Anne fans. I have been rereading Anne of Green Gables, the entire book series, and I'm loving it. And today we are going to chat about Anne's House of Dreams. I have my Finnish copy here, so it is Anna omassa kodissaan. Bit of a tongue twister for non-Finnish speakers. This is my copy from 1992 reprint, because the lady who created the illustration, Eeli Jaatinen, she was a very popular illustrator in the 1950s and in the 1940s in Finland, and she illustrated Little Woman series and Anne of Green Gables, among other things. I recognize her style, so this must be a reprint because she did those originals in the 1940s. But this is quite lovely. It has Anne and Gilbert getting married. There's the priest, I assume. There's going to be lots of spoilers in this review. Let's get into it. This is the 5th book in Anne of Green Gables series. Anne and Gilbert are finally getting married and they are ready to settle down and start their life together. But they are not going to stay in Avonlea. They are moving to the little village of St. Glen, to the Four Wind Points. And this village is a little seaside town. If I briefly go through some of the main characters, of course we have Gilbert and Anne. We have Captain Jim Boyd, who is the lighthouse keeper, and he's in his 70s, but he's described to be this very friendly man. And he is also their closest neighbor. Another interesting character is Miss Cornelia Bryant, who lives in the village. I think Anne compares her to Mrs. Lind in Avonlea, so she's the local Miss Rachel Lind. If that is an insult or if it's a compliment, you can decide. Then we have Leslie Moore, who in my opinion is the most interesting character in this book. Leslie is another one of their very close neighbors, so I would imagine that the Four Wind Points is in the outskirts of this village. And Gilbert's uncle is retiring and he's a doctor, so Gilbert takes over his practice. When Anne and Gilbert move, there are very sweet descriptions of their newlywed lives. Everything is going smoothly. Then one day, Anne sees Leslie Moore on the seaside. And Leslie looks Anne with a hostile look. Now, Anne, based on the book series, in my opinion, is someone who always likes to have a bit of a validation from people. She wants that people like her. And it's also mentioned in the novel quite a few times. Not only in this one, but in other Anne of Green Gables books as well. It might be because Anne is an orphan and when she was a child, she did not feel wanted. Then she got positive confirmation when Matthew and Marilla adopted her. Especially Matthew gave her that positive confirmation, and later on Marilla as well. But I think Anne has a bit of that insecurity about herself. She wants everybody to like her. But Leslie does not seem to like her. And Anne wonders why Leslie feels so hostile. And Anne does develop somewhat a friendship with Leslie. But Leslie is always a little cold and distant. So Leslie is written to be, I think she was 27 or something. Leslie is a beautiful, tall, blonde woman. Her hair is written to look like gold and sunlight. It's so long it reaches to her legs, but during the day her hair is braided. Captain Jim and Miss Cornelia become friends with Anne and Gilbert very quickly. I will talk a bit more about Miss Cornelia later. She is described to be someone who is a suffragette, an early feminist. She supports women's right to vote. I don't know when Canada allowed women to vote. But whenever that happened, I'm sure that Miss Cornelia had something to do with it. Maybe. And Miss Cornelia has some very strong opinions about men, which are really funny. She doesn't have children of her own, but she's always making clothes for the children that are being born, which I think is quite endearing. I think in some ways, back in the days, there was a different level of community and people did look after each other. At least those like Miss Cornelia looked after other people. Miss Cornelia and Captain Jim, they tell Anne Leslie's tale and it is very tragic. Leslie is married to a man called Dick Moore. Leslie was 12 when her brother died in an accident, and when Leslie was 14, her father hanged himself and she found the body. That's traumatizing. And when Leslie was 16, she was forced to marry a man called Dick Moore. Dick Moore was a sailor, a drunk, and someone who was very aggressive and violent with women. But soon after the wedding, Dick sailed off to Jamaica and Cuba, and no one heard him for many years. Then Captain Jim found Dick from a bar in Havana, and Dick had a large bruise in his head, and he could not remember who he was. His whole personality was different. The head injury affected his brains. He became more like a child. In the book they refer to him being like a big baby. So when we meet Leslie in the book, there she is, almost in her 30s, bound to this man who she was forced to marry, and she is now his caretaker. And he is described to be a bit of a simpleton. He does not understand things. His brain does not function the way it used to do. And this leads us to one of the best plot twists that I have ever read from Lucy Maud Montgomery. It is as good as the real identity of Barney Snate in Blue Castle. Blue Castle is my favorite Lucy Maud Montgomery book, but I'm not going to spoil that. You have to read Blue Castle. But the plot twist is so good. I love the character of Leslie. I think she's so interesting, so tragic, and how lonely you must be. She has lost her brother and her father who she adored. She has lost her mother who she loved. Captain Jim is her friend. Miss Cornelia is her friend and becomes her friend, but Leslie does feel that she's trapped. And in a way she is. This book does take place in the beginning of the 20th century. Anne's House of Dreams was published in 1917. So divorce is not really an option. Divorces were very expensive back then, so you had to be a wealthy person to get a divorce, which is quite awful, especially if you were in a bad marriage. So divorce is not an option. And I think there is also probably some kind of religious thinking behind that. You must stick into a marriage, even if it's a bad marriage. And of course, Dick as a character, because of the brain injury, he does not know what happens around him. I'm not a medical expert. I would just imagine that those wires that we have in our brains, him are sort of unplugged because of this brain injury. So yeah, there are certain things that he can understand and he can do, but then those things that connect ideas in our brains together, those don't work. But this book is also quite an interesting look about the way medicine works in the early 1900s. But then things get a dramatic twist because a writer called Owen Ford arrives to Four Points Wind, and he is a very pleasant looking man in his early 30s. Of course he is. And Anne suggests him that he would write the life story of Captain Jim, because Captain Jim has sailed the 7 seas and has great sea shanties and stories to tell. And Owen Ford gets excited and interviews him and starts writing. But then, of course, he's staying at Leslie. He's renting a room from her house. And then one night he sees her in veranda, her hair loose, and he immediately falls in love with her. Lucy Maud Montgomery would have written epic movies for us. Maybe in the next life. I just love the way everything unfolds in this story. It just goes from one thing to another in a flash. It's crazy. And when I was a child and I read this book, I thought this was one of the most boring Luisa May Alcott stories. Clearly, I wasn't paying enough attention. When you read this and you are in your 20s and in your 30s, it opens up in a whole different level. And this is a light-hearted book, and this is a dark book. It has like this fine balance between very light themes, jokes and all that, and then there are these very heavy things about loss, depression, losing people you love, and also just this heavy darkness that can consume you, especially when you've had lots of very tragical bad things happening to you during your life. Leslie's behavior when one day you meet her and she's very friendly and kind towards you, the next day you meet her, she's resentful, maybe even a bit aggressive, and you get this impression that she does not want to be in your company. All of that is really her suppressed trauma, and you cannot blame her for those things. But then we get into the wonderful plot twist. So what happens is that one day Gilbert takes a good look at Dick Moore's injured head, and he thinks that he might be able to help him because Gilbert is a doctor, but he is this new kind of doctor. He wants to try new things, he wants to experiment, and he believes that maybe with the right procedure they might be able to restore Dick Moore's brain back to the way it was before the incident. And surprisingly, it is now Anne who is very much against that. And another person who is against that is Gilbert's uncle, the old Dr. Blythe, who is more of a traditional, more on the conservative side kind of doctor. Anne's heart is in the right place, but so is Gilbert's. Gilbert believes that as a doctor it is his duty to do what is best for the patient, even when he knows that the patient is a man that originally was very aggressive and very vile man like Dick Moore. Anne's heart is on Leslie's side. She's afraid that, okay, what if you fix Dick Moore's head and he comes back and he remembers things? It's going to be even worse for Leslie because now life with Dick is difficult but is bearable. If Dick's memory is restored, he becomes again violent and aggressive and abusive towards his wife, which makes Leslie's life more difficult. And this creates a big contention between Anne and Gilbert, their first big argument, and neither one of them is wrong or right, because there's not a right or wrong answer to the question. But Gilbert does tell Leslie that this surgery is an option, and Leslie, who is morally upright, same way as Gilbert, agrees to that. And I think in her mind, Leslie feels like her life cannot get any worse even if Dick's memory is restored. She has the protection of Dr. Jim, Anne and Gilbert, and Mrs. Cornelia. Of course she's afraid what's going to happen. I do wonder if Leslie thought that maybe Dick would agree to a divorce or something, if there was enough pressure from the people from her circles. I don't know. But Leslie does agree to the surgery. Leslie, Dick, and Gilbert travel to Montreal and they go through the surgery. And the great plot twist, this man was never Dick Moore. It is his cousin George, who was also a sailor. It turns out that 12 years ago, Dick and George were in Cuba together and Dick died there. The two cousins looked alike because their mothers were sisters and their fathers were brothers, and they both had a condition in their eyes. One eye was green and the other eye was blue. Apparently it is called heterochromia, but it was the eye colors that allowed Captain Jim to recognize this man as Dick Moore. But he was not Dick Moore ever. He was always George Moore. But people did not know that. Plot twist. So Leslie can take a sigh of relief. She was a widow of Dick Moore, therefore free to live her life just the way as she would like to. The book is really interesting look on female friendships and the development of female friendships. When Anne and Gilbert first move, the first time the two women meet, Leslie sees Anne dancing on the rocks without a care of the world. And she is jealous. But now that we know Leslie's backstory, can we blame her for being jealous? No, we cannot. When Anne tells Leslie that she is pregnant, Leslie gets angry and snaps out at her. Later on she regrets that and sends Anne a beautiful dress that she has made herself for the baby. The baby is very expected. Anne is excited, Gilbert is excited, everyone is excited. Marilla comes from Avonlea to take care of Anne during the childbirth. I always love Marilla. She's one of my favorite characters. Sadly, Anne ends up losing the child. They named the child Joyce, and she's buried in the dress that Leslie made. Anne goes a period of deep sadness and loss, naturally. And I read this from Lucy Maud Montgomery's biography that Anne losing her daughter is something that is based on Lucy Maud Montgomery's experiences of her losing one of her children. Now, Lucy Maud Montgomery, I think she had 2 sons, but she had a daughter who died in infancy. So those emotions and the feelings that Anne's go through in the book, those are based on what happened in the author's life. So I think that's one of the reasons why these books feel so authentic, why those feelings feel so raw, so real. Montgomery reveals things that happen to her, things that really break person's heart. When I was reading, like almost broke my heart was when she was writing about how Anne imagined her daughter growing up, how she becomes a toddler, how she becomes a 5-year-old, how she grows to be a woman, but it happens on the other side. That is also something that Anne imagines, believes that happens to her choice on the other side of the veil. Now, if I remember right, Anne and Gilbert had 6 children. Correct me if I'm wrong or if I'm right. They had lots of kids anyway, and little Joyce was one of them, even though if she grew up on the other side of the veil. Of course, Leslie ends up falling in love with Owen Ford. Owen finishes his book about Captain Jim's life. Captain passes away in the end of the novel, happy that his life's work is now in print and he manages to read the biography that was written about him. Owen and Leslie live happily ever after, at least in my mind. Together with those very heavy themes in this book, there are also many light-hearted moments. Most of them, I think, is provided by Miss Cornelia Bryant. She's such a funny character. Ever since I was a child, I have been reading Anne of Green Gables series and also Little Woman trilogy. I have to emphasize. I'm also the host of the Little Woman podcast. This whole channel is called the Little Woman channel. I always thought that Miss Cornelia from this book, she reminds me of Jo March, or should I say Jo Bear, in Jo's Boys, because both characters are set on with women needing the vote to right, and both characters are suffragettes. Both end up marrying bearded men. She's funny because she criticizes men quite a lot in the book, a lot more than Jo March does. There's an election that happens in this book. I don't know enough about Canadian politics. Left-wing wings and a man named Marshall Elliott, who has been growing his hair and beard for a decade, is so happy about this victory that he goes to a barber and asks him to shave everything off. And at some point Mr. Marshall proposes Miss Cornelia and she agrees to marry him. But it's only after he has shaved his beard and cut his hair. It's hilarious. But that, I say, must be one of the bigger differences between Jo and Miss Cornelia, because Jo absolutely loved bearded men. People don't pay enough attention to that. You just have to read Jo's Boys. It's mentioned there quite a few times. So no wonder Jo married a bearded professor from Germany. Do check out my playlist about Louisa May Alcott and the real-life Frederick Bear, the American ones and the German ones. And also, for those of you who are fans of both Anne of Green Gables and A Little Woman, do check out the podcast episodes I did with my friend Star about Jo March and Shirley through Heroine's journey story narrative. It's super fascinating. You can find the Little Woman podcast playlist on my channel. What else can I say? This is not my absolute favorite Anne of Green Gables book. My favorite is Anne of Windy Poplars. But this one is definitely ranking higher now than it did before. I find this book possibly the most psychologically interesting Anne of Green Gables book in the series. Let me know in the comments which Anne of Green Gables book is your favorite. I highly recommend reading this one. I think this is a good read for like a nice summer day when you are traveling. If you live in a seaside city and there is a nice lighthouse somewhere, there are many beautiful descriptions about a seaside town, the sea, the beaches, lighthouse. Imagining yourself being in a lighthouse by the fire, listening to this old sea bear telling all these tales from distant lands. That's the mood of this book that I'm getting. Or just living in this beautiful beach house with seashells covering all the paths and the garden patches. That's Anne's House of Dreams. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye bye. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoy bookish content, do subscribe to my channel and set on the notifications. I do make lots of content about Little Woman and the Alcott sisters. I also speak about filmmakers who have lied about everything that there is to lie about Little Woman. I also speak about books that I enjoy reading. If you are interested solely in the Little Woman content, do join my free newsletter at littlewomanchannel.substack.com and get notified when new episodes of the Little Woman podcast appear. Take care and make good choices. Bye.